Welcome back to Coordinating Clinical Trials. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about subject safety, which is really important in your study coordinator role. So what we're looking at mainly are serious adverse events, and we're going to be talking about that in a little more detail as we go along. But I've listed for you the purpose directly from ICHE 6 that you can read there on the slide. But essentially, we're going to be talking about what your responsibility is as far as reporting the serious adverse event to the sponsor within 24 hours of becoming aware of it, and then what expected SAEs there are in the trial that are detailed in the investigator's brochure. Once you submit a serious adverse event report, an initial report, you're probably going to have a series of follow-up reports that you're going to be required to submit, so you need to be familiar with that process. You'll also report these to the IRB based on what their reporting requirements are. Also, make sure that there's no PHI in any of the reports that you send, either to the sponsor or the CRO or the IRB. Let's talk about what our learning objectives are. We're going to discuss adverse events and serious adverse events, so AEs and SAEs. We're going to cite the requirements for study reporting, both for the coordinator or the site and also for the sponsor to the regulatory authority. We're also going to discuss the role of the study coordinator in subject safety. And then finally, we're going to discuss notification of investigators to trial safety information. So let's talk about what an adverse event is and what a serious adverse event is. So it's important to understand that adverse events or AEs are very, very common in clinical trials. They happen all the time. They're expected. An adverse event is essentially any change in the subject's health baseline. So it's any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical trial subject administered a medicinal product which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with this treatment. So it's essentially, as I just said, any change in a subject's health from their baseline. So think of it like this: as anything from a headache to a heart attack. For instance, subject has some diarrhea during the trial. That's an adverse event. Subject experienced some headaches. It's an adverse event. Subject falls down while playing pickleball and sprains their ankle. Guess what? It's an adverse event. Is it necessarily caused by the study drug? In almost every case, it normally is not. Probably fewer than 5% of the AEs that the subject experiences during the trial are actually related to the study drug. But your responsibility as the site coordinator is to collect information on these and to poll or ask your participants if they've had any changes that need to be documented as adverse events. So where do adverse events come from? They are reported by the subjects. So when they come in for your visit, you're going to discuss with them about any changes they've had to their health, how they felt since their last visit. You're probably not going to say, hey, have you had any adverse events since you were here last, because they probably aren't going to know what that means. But just, have you been to the doctor? Have you been sick since you were here last? If so, what were your symptoms? Did you go to an urgent care clinic? Did you see your primary care physician? Did you have to go to the emergency room for any reason? You want to poll those subjects and find out if they've experienced any changes since their last visit. You will also find adverse events on some of the medical reporting, such as lab reports, any out of range lab results. That can be an adverse event. Um, that's why your PI needs to be reviewing those and assessing whether or not those out of range lab values have clinical significance. Because if they do, then that's considered an adverse event and you need to record that as such. You might have an ECG reading that exposes an adverse event. You can have any other kind of medical report that might also show an adverse event. These can be observed by the site staff during the visit. For example, when you're taking vital signs, that might expose a possible adverse event. The other thing that's much more common now are electronic patient reported outcomes, or EPROs. These are devices very similar to smartphones that many subjects get issued during the trial. They use it to keep track of dosing diaries. They may also use it to keep track of any changes in their health. If they've experienced any sickness or any symptoms, they'll record those in there. And sometimes, you're not always alerted to these, and so you have to monitor those portals where that data is contained, because someone from the sponsor or maybe someone from the CRO is monitoring that for any potential adverse events. So that's becoming more and more common as trials start using more devices. We've talked about what an adverse event is, anything from a headache to a heart attack. Now let's talk about what a serious adverse event is. So a serious adverse event is an AE that results in death, which hopefully is going to be extremely rare, is life-threatening in the assessment of the PI, an adverse event that requires hospitalization or prolongs an existing hospitalization. Now, it's important to understand this means the patient was admitted to the hospital typically overnight. If they only went to the emergency room, this probably is not a serious adverse event, but it's good to get those medical records and go over those and review them. It can result in persistent or significant disability or incapacity. And it can also consist of a congenital anomaly or a birth defect. This can occur, birth defects could occur in the subject participant, or it might be the spouse of a subject participant. These are things that you need to be aware of. Most trials are going to immediately terminate a subject who becomes pregnant or a partner of a subject who becomes pregnant. So that's probably not going to happen very often. But anyway, the primary takeaway here for serious adverse events, it's got to be result in death, be life-threatening, or involve a hospitalization stay. So for each adverse event that you collect from your subjects, the principal investigator or their delegate, who is either an MD or a DO or a physician's assistant or nurse practitioner, is going to assess each AE for mild, severe to serious. And then the severity includes the intensity of the AE. You're also going to collect what its relationship is with the study drug. In many cases, it's not going to be related, but there can be cases where it might be related. You're also going to collect what action was taken with the study drug. For example, was the study drug suspended? Was the dose modified as a result of the AE? And then also what if the AE was treated or not. Was there other medication involved? For instance, if the AE was treated with an additional medication, that would go on the concomitant medication log. If there was a procedure done that was part of the treatment, that would go on the procedures log. So you want to collect all of these pieces of information when you're assessing adverse events. So we talked about collecting adverse event data. Now let's talk about the requirements for safety reporting by the investigator or by your site, specifically you. So first of all, you must report a potential serious adverse event within 24 hours of learning of the event to the sponsor. This can be reported by phone, by fax, if people still use fax machines, or through some other reporting process. Now, it's important to understand one key fact here. So, the moment you become aware of a potential serious adverse event, that's the moment that your 24 hours begins. So, you need to make the sponsor aware of that within 24 hours. You may only have small detail. You may not have any details at all, other than a patient was in the hospital, for instance. But whatever you have, go ahead and report it then, so you can fulfill that 24-hour reporting requirement and not get an important protocol deviation from that. The other piece of that component, is that now many of the EDC systems that you use are programmed in a fashion where the moment you enter data and you indicate serious adverse event equals yes, it immediately notifies the sponsor's medical monitoring team. So they get an email or they get alerted in some other fashion. So once that happens, they're going to contact you almost immediately and try to find out more information on that. So you have to be ready for that. The other piece of it is these need to be reported to your IRB. Now, in some cases, certain serious adverse events may not meet the IRB reporting requirements, but it's good practice for you to go ahead and report it, get the acknowledgement, store that in your investigator site file so you've got proof that you reported it, even if they come back and tell you, hey, this doesn't need to be reported, and then you can leave it at that. So it's important to understand what your responsibilities are in reporting serious adverse events. So specifically, your responsibilities as a study coordinator in subject safety, you're going to ensure that all AEs are collected and are entered into the electronic case report form, the EDC system. You're going to ensure that all serious adverse events are reported to the sponsor within 24 hours. You also report these serious adverse events to the IRB, and then you'll ensure that all safety information is filed at site. So what that means is that if you've got a subject who was, say, in the hospital for an overnight stay, you need to contact the hospital and try and get those medical records. So your clinical site will have a medical records release form. You need to get the subject to sign that probably early on in the trial so that you can obtain those records as necessary. Then you can submit that to the clinic or the hospital and get those medical records, because you're going to need that, because there may be other adverse events that are associated with that serious adverse event. There's going to be concomitant medications that you're going to need to record in your ConMed log that they were given while they were in the hospital. So that's why you need to collect those records, and the sponsor's medical team is going to want to see those records as well. Just make sure as you're submitting those that you redact any PHI from those records, because there's probably going to be some included in there. So now that we've talked about your reporting requirements to the sponsor and to the IRB, let's transition for a moment and discuss what the sponsor needs to do in terms of notifying principal investigators and others about serious adverse events. So for instance, the sponsor is going to notify each investigator of safety information that meets certain requirements. All right, so what that means is that as the sponsor assesses each serious adverse event and tries to determine a causal relationship with the with the study drug, they're going to go through what's known as an adjudication process. So what this means is that they're going to they're going to issue what we call SUSARs, which are suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reaction reports. So these are also known as safety reports or safety letters. And it's important to understand that these reports are related to the IP product, not necessarily the protocol. You'll have sponsors that have multiple protocols going for the same IP product. So what that means is that if a SUSAR is issued for another for a different protocol, you're still going to find out about it if you're using that particular product. So your investigator is going to find out about that because they need to be aware of it. These are often called IND safety letters. They're sort of similar. These are reported to the IRB, so they need to be made aware of it. There's a specific form that I'll show you in a moment that's called a CIOMS form. This stands for Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. I'll show you what that looks like here in just a moment. That'll be a form that you'll see sent to your site that you need to be aware of, and you need to make sure your PI reads through that and is aware of it. So in the context of this safety reporting, we need to understand the difference between adverse events versus adverse drug reactions. So as we mentioned earlier, adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical investigation subject administered a pharmaceutical product and which does not necessarily have to have a causal relationship with this treatment or with the product. So think about that. We've already talked about adverse events, and then we'll talk about adverse drug reactions. So an adverse drug reaction in the pre-approval clinical experience with a new medicinal product or its new usages, particularly as a therapeutic dose, may not be established. So all noxious or unintended responses to a medicinal product related to any dose should be considered an adverse drug reaction. So the phrase responses to medicinal products means that a causal relationship between the medicinal product and an adverse event is at least a reasonable possibility. In other words, the relationship cannot be ruled out. So although your PI is going to be assessing each adverse event for a causal relationship, or whether or not it's related to the study drug, there's still going to be a process going on behind the scenes with the sponsor's medical staff to further adjudicate whether or not there is indeed an adverse drug reaction or there isn't an adverse drug reaction. So these may change from as you go along. You may have, your PI may say, yeah, this is related to the drug. There may be more investigation that goes on, and it's determined in consultation with your PI that it's not related. That you let the medical Let the MDs take care of that. They discuss all that stuff, and then so there could be changes to that as you go along. So we talked about what your notification responsibilities are. The sponsor also has some notification responsibilities as well. So the sponsor has a notification of safety information to the FDA. These reporting requirements are detailed in ICH E2A. Now I have included that among your reading for this lesson, so you can take a look at that and become more familiar with it. So this would include any fatal or life-threatening unexpected adverse drug reactions. So in this case, they are required to submit to FDA within 7 calendar days. That's primarily the reason why when you do have a serious adverse event, they want all of these follow-up items. They want as much information as quickly as they can get it, so they can make an assessment and comply with this 7-day requirement. So this is followed up by as complete a report as possible within an additional 8 calendar days. So they got 15 days to gather as much information as they can and report that to the FDA. So that's the reason they're going to ask for these follow-up items and ask for as much information from you as you can provide. So all other serious unexpected adverse drug reactions, the sponsor should report that no later than 15 calendar days with as complete a report as possible. So while you're working on a clinical trial, it's very possible that you're going to receive these SUSAR reports, or safety reports as they're commonly called. So what's your responsibility? All right, so the principal investigator must assess these and must acknowledge that the principal investigator has received them. So this can be done in a number of different ways. Either you get the report, say via email, for instance, and you print it out for the investigator, they sign and date it, acknowledging that they received it. You then need to submit this to your IRB if you're using a local IRB. If your site is using a central IRB, probably the CRO or the sponsor is going to submit that on your behalf, so you won't have to do it. The other thing that has to be done is the PI has got to train the site staff on the contents of that safety report. And that needs to be documented that they did that. So that's important for you to make sure that that process happens. It's good to have an SOP, a standard operating procedure for this particular task. And it needs to be written down, and you should be able to provide that to your monitor when they come out. The other component to this that you as the coordinator need to be aware of is that now more and more sponsors and CROs are using portals, or they're using other technology platforms for this safety reporting process. So for instance, you may have access to the platform that houses all the safety letters, and maybe it's your responsibility to pull those down and to make sure they're filed properly. There's probably a notification capability with that platform where the PI gets automatically notified whenever a new safety letter is issued or a follow-up report is issued, and they're probably required, the PI that is probably required to go in there and indicate they've acknowledged receipt of that report. So it's important to understand early on in the trial from your monitor, how that process is going to work, so that you're aware of what you need to do on your end to make sure that you cover all the bases. So I alluded to the SIOMS form earlier. So this is what it looks like. This comes from the Council for International Organizations and Medical Sciences, and you can pull these off the internet, so you'll see exactly what information is collected there. It's basically a standardized tool for collecting adverse drug reaction information, and it'll indicate on there if it's an initial report versus follow-up number one, follow-up two. Um, you'll probably complete some of these, and some of these will need to be submitted to your IRB. But this is what the form looks like. So as you see them, you'll know what they are. So here are your reading assignments for this lesson. I've posted these on Blackboard. Of course, the first one there is from your textbook, but these will amplify, what I've gone over in this lecture. That'll help you understand everything a little bit clearer. Then finally, for your discussion forum for this lesson, you're a coordinator working at a clinical site. You come into work on a Monday, and all of a sudden there's a voicemail message left on the office voicemail over the weekend that indicates that there was one of your clinical trial participants was in the hospital during the weekend. So the caller left the participant's name but no other information. So at this point, you've got a possible serious adverse event if the patient was in the hospital. So explain what you're going to do next after you listen to the message, and then post that on the discussion board. So think about what your reporting requirements are, and kind of think through the scenario there, and think about what you're going to do next, and post it out there to the discussion forum.